What's up guys, this is E-House from Gun Gamers, and today I'm going to talk about a subset of the airsoft market that certainly gets plenty of attention, but maybe not in the way that I'm going to cover it today. We're going to be talking about budget airsoft electric guns. I know 90% of you have already just clicked off this video. My viewer base tends to be a little more toward the experienced and the hardcore, but hear me out. I'm going to be making this video largely for people who are newer to the game, or maybe parents who are shopping for their first airsoft gun, or maybe, if they're willing to listen, industry people who want to hear what the player base has to say about what they prioritize at certain price points for certain products. So today's video is going to discuss kind of what feature sets and what build materials and what priorities really should be set for an airsoft gun that comes in like $200 or less, aimed toward newer players or maybe players who don't want to spend a bunch of money, and what that gun should aim to accomplish and what that gun should aim to do to have the best chance of success in the market based on kind of what I've observed in my time playing. Now, I've been at airsoft for way too long. I've been playing since like 2007. And I have observed a lot of changes in the market. I remember the tail end of the Clone Wars when JG and CYMA and UTG introduced the lower priced AEGs. I remember when G&G had the Plastica series and Classic Army had their Sportline series. Then the Combat Machine series took the market by storm. And now we've got this whole plethora of pretty good budget option AEGs that didn't exist really when I started. So you stupid kids today have it easy. But because that market is so saturated, it can be kind of hard to find the best way to make your product stand out the most and to identify exactly what you need in a budget AEG, either from shopping or from manufacturing. What features should you prioritize, and what's going to have, in my opinion, the best effect on the customer who purchases the product? This video is kind of brought about because I have these three AEGs that would meet this definition in my possession right now. I have the Lancer Tactical Warlord, I have the Tippmann Commando. A review of this is coming, I promise. I just haven't used it enough yet to really feel comfortable giving an in-depth opinion. And I have this CYMA AKMS underfolder. And all of these kind of fit within that niche, but do it just a little bit differently. And this is what prompted my thoughts on this subject, and now I'm going to share them with you. So if you're interested, buckle in, it should be fun. To start with, this is something I want to criticize a lot of clone companies for. A budget airsoft gun targeted toward a beginner should be field legal out of the box. And unfortunately, there are a lot of Chinese-made airsoft guns where you'll buy them, well, Chinese-made and not American distributed or whatever, airsoft guns where you'll buy them, and out of the box, they're shooting over 400 feet per second. Now, at some fields and events, that doesn't matter as much, but generally speaking, in the United States, most indoor fields where a lot of new players start out have a 350 foot per second limit. And then a lot of outdoor fields have a 400 foot per second limit. So when you come in over 400 feet per second with your gun's initial out of the box velocity, then you've eliminated the ability to use the gun right out of the box at a legitimate field. A lot of people will say, well, new players don't care about that. They're probably just playing in their backyard anyway. Well, this is kind of one of those cases where maybe the customer doesn't know what's good for them, because if a customer who doesn't care if their gun is field legal or doesn't even know what field legal is buying a gun that has the highest velocity just because they think the higher number sounds good, then what are the odds that customer really knows much about like wearing real full seal rated ANSI goggles? What if they're not wearing proper protective equipment? What if they are not officiating their games because they're playing in their backyard and people are taking their eye protection off? Or what if they're not wearing eye protection? Now, I know it sounds very condescending to assume that everyone who's not playing at a legit field all the time is an idiot, and that it sounds very nannying to say, well, we have to protect the children. But it goes to show how there's really no good reason for a beginner's marketed airsoft gun to come in at a velocity that isn't field legal in 90% of the market. It just strikes me as asinine. I think the greatest frustration with that is that you'll have a new player who buys their first airsoft gun, and maybe they buy a CYMA AK, because these are very robust, very sturdy, very well-built guns. They're some of the better AKs on the market in general, but they buy one of the models and it comes in and it shoots like 430 feet per second, and their local field's limit is 400. They can't use their brand new gun that they just dropped a bunch of money on at their local field the day they got it. So now they have to drop more money or learn to open the gearbox and downgrade it. So that's the type of thing where a new player who doesn't really understand how all this works just yet is going to buy this and be like, well, that's bullshit. Why am I into this hobby? And that's kind of an experience that I think we've all seen one person we know have at one point or another, where they buy a gun and for one petty frustration or another, the gun either doesn't work or the gun won't be allowed, or they can't use the gun. And all of a sudden, now they're pissed and they're like, well, this is stupid. Why did I buy this? And now they're immediately starting off on a note of frustration with the game. To avoid that, one of the easiest things you can do is just make sure the gun can be used at a field out of the box. That's really just one of the biggest things that you need to do. Going along with that, not only does the velocity need to be usable, but the gun needs to be usable. So I know people get upset that there's so many M4s for beginner guns, but the reason for that is because the AR-15 is a very user-friendly platform. It's something that a lot of people are familiar with and something that's very easy to learn. The AK is a kind of similar thing, and there's a lot of these out there that are intended for beginners as well. Now, we're starting to see more budget-friendly non-M4 and AK guns come out on the market, but they're also still relatively popular platforms that are very easy to learn. Then you have things like the Lancer Tactical Warlord, where they go for a bit of a different form factor to set it aside, set it apart in the marketplace, just that little bit, make it a little more unique. And that's a good feature to have, is just a little bit of uniqueness that makes people want to buy your gun as opposed to someone else's gun. So if you've got a cool rail system or a cool flash hider, or if you take pistol mags and you're an ARP9, then that's one of those weird things that can make a new player who wants to stand out, they want to show up to the field and they want to feel and look cool. That's what Airsoft is about to a certain extent. So they might want to buy something unique and different. So offering that in that price point is a good idea, just as long as it's a platform that doesn't compromise usability for uniqueness, which I have a hard time defining exactly what that means, but let me put it this way. If in your testing it is significantly harder to use than an AR-15, it's probably not worth making for a beginner. Just my thought. So now that you have a platform that's easy to use and a platform that can be used at fields, what goes into this platform? I'm going to maybe go against the grain here and say that airsoft guns targeted toward beginners should be exceptionally simple, both mechanically and electronically. I know that there's been a trend of putting, more and more micro switches and MOSFETs into cheaper and cheaper guns, but based on what I've seen with some of those systems, as those systems try to get cheaper and cheaper, the reliability factor for some of them goes down. And that's another thing where your quality control really has to be on top of making sure that these electronics are all good to go, and your manufacturing and your quality of the electronics period needs to make sure that these aren't going to fail. Because if someone has the experience that I had with the G&G ETU, where it'll continue to just blow out fuses until they swap the motor, then that's a very bad experience for someone to have with their first airsoft gun. Someone who isn't going to have the patience to say, oh, well, I just need to swap the motor. No, this is someone who's going to say, I just paid $200. Why the hell am I having to replace fuses every magazine? You got to really make sure it is robust and simple and easy to keep running. Analog electronics, like just the classic trigger contacts, no MOSFET, none of that other stuff, those have been reliable and relied on in budget guns for a very long time. In my opinion, for good reason. They're very easy to make, and when you're trying to come in at a price point, it's easy to make those well while still maintaining a good profit margin because they don't need a bunch of extra quality testing and a bunch of extra warranty replacement if you get a bad batch of electronics. So just something to keep in mind. I do think that keeping things as simple as possible is a good idea, mostly because newer players aren't going to have the experience level to appreciate a lot of the features that come with something like a programmable MOSFET or a quick change spring gearbox. They're going to want something that's just going to work 9 times out of 10. And then if you pair that with the fact that you're bringing your gun in at a field legal velocity, that should hopefully mean that you're not going to have to overly reinforce the internals. Now, the internals do still need to be robust enough to hold up to the use of an inexperienced player, someone who's going to be shooting a lot to accomplish a relatively low number of kills probably, but that's part of the learning experience. We've all been there. I mean, some of us are still there, hello, but you need to make sure that your gearbox design and your gearbox materials are robust enough to handle heavy use, but they also need to be simple enough that they're not overly expensive to manufacture, and then you start going up over your price point. An easy way to do this is if you keep your gun under 400 feet per second, as you should be, then you're able to just make sure you put the things together correctly with well quality controlled parts. And it's probably going to run for a very long time, at least long enough for the player to get some experience under their belt. And then by the time it breaks or it needs maintenance or something goes wrong, it's not going to be as much a frustration because they've gotten tens of thousands of BBs out of it. And now they might be ready to open it up or bring it to a tech and start upgrading and start finding out just what they can do with this hobby. So I'm a big proponent of making sure that you have, at the very least, metal bushings, good gears that aren't going to break, a piston that isn't going to pre-engage, decent angle of engagement, and everything else can kind of be as cheap as you can go while still keeping it reliable. That's really what I look for in a budget gun. I don't have that high of expectations for having like a CNC'd aluminum cylinder head or having a steel tooth rack piston or having any other ridiculous stuff that you find in higher end guns like VFC and G&P and Crytac and LCT, because these guns are trying to come in at a price point and they do need to be cheap enough to manufacture that you are still making money on selling them. But if it's well put together with good quality control, and if it's coming in at a low enough velocity that you're not really stressing the parts that much, then you can afford to get away with more. And I think that we see that in the examples of like the Dytac OEM'd gearboxes, some of the Lonix OEM'd gearboxes, and some of the SEMA gearboxes, or CYMA, however you want to pronounce that, in that the actual components inside are pretty cheap. But if you run them at a reasonable velocity, they seem to last forever in a lot of cases. Up to quality control though, because I know that CYMA every now and then will have one grenade, but that's because it's a Chinese gun that's not made with much quality control, so you get that sometimes. So that's a pitfall to avoid, is make sure that you have really good quality control, and even then you can overcome having some cheaper parts if they're put together very well. Let's talk about externals now, because internally the gun needs to be very robust but still cheaply made so you can still make money. But externally, what are people prioritizing these days in the market? I said that, a little bit of a unique platform is nice, and something that sets you apart in the market is nice, and easy to use is nice. But more so than that, where should you be putting your money when you're building these guns? Because that's what building these is. You are putting money into making this product. Well, if you want to choose where to prioritize, make sure that your receiver, your main body, and all the other polymer components you choose to use, because most of these are probably going to be polymer bodied, are a very sturdy, very robust polymer build quality. A good benchmark for this is the G&G Combat Machine series. You can say whatever else you want about the Combat Machine, but no one can take away the fact that for being a plastic body, they are incredibly durable. And it seems like most of the airsoft market has followed in G&G's stead with the quality of their polymer that they use for a lot of their components. Other than that though, you really should focus on making sure that there's no significant failure points. You should design the gun so that any really high stress joints are suitably reinforced to handle mishandling. Now, I know that this sounds contradictory to say, well, you can kind of cheap out, but it needs to be reinforced. And that's because these are younger or newer players in a lot of cases who aren't going to be running these guns on slings, who aren't going to baby their stuff. I mean, some of us still don't baby our stuff and maybe break things too often. Hello again. But that's why it's all the more important that you make sure that things like the buffer tube screw should always be a very solid metal. That's something that just needs to not break, because if people have to replace a buffer tube screw, then they're going to be mad at you. Or let's say you have your stock here. This stock hopefully is going to be strong enough to handle whatever a kid is putting it through, because they don't necessarily think about the fact that this is a polymer component held on by one little screw to a polymer lower receiver into a gearbox that has a metal thread sleeve but is a polymer spring guide. They're not thinking about the fact that if they drop this gun on the buttstock, it might break. So you need to make sure that it is reinforced enough and that you kind of do take some attention to detail steps that help prevent them from doing their own stupid things, and that way you get to save on having too many RMAs. Like for example here, Lancer Tactical put the sling mounts to the front of this stock so that there's not a bunch of leverage on the rear when people are dropping it on a sling. That's a good idea, because then it's not going to break this little joint off where the outer stock or the end of the stock joins up with the front of the stock. That was a good move on their part. That's little attention to detail that you need to consider. In my opinion, every budget gun should come with some kind of sighting system, and ideally, it should be better than what Lancer Tactical included with the Warlord, because these sights don't zero. Now, I know a lot of airsofters don't use their sights, but for people who are coming over to airsoft from shooting real firearms, a lot of them are going to be looking to have sights that work, and a good example of those are the sights that the Tippmann Commando included. These sights can be effectively zeroed, and I did zero them, and I used them at the one game I've been able to use this at so far, and they worked very nicely. So look to something like this if you're making an AR, or if you're making an AK. The sights are built in, they're super cheap to make. If you make an AK without built-in iron sights, what even are you doing with your life? Speaking of sights, let's talk about range and accuracy. Now, I know that accuracy components can cost a bit of money to make. Anyone who's ever paid for a Pro-In hop-up unit can attest to that. But if you are trying to build an airsoft gun that a beginner is going to be buying, then to a certain extent, you also want to be their best first impression. Because an airsoft gun that a beginner picks up and the BBs go everywhere, they're not going to be as impressed as an airsoft gun that a beginner picks up and their shots are straight and consistent. Another good example of this is the Tippmann Commando. Has pretty respectable range and accuracy out of the box for an airsoft gun that comes in at its price point. And the SEMA AKs lately have been shooting very well for my teammates and I, even with the stock hop-up bucking and barrel. The Lancer Tactical Warlord we had a little more trouble with, not quite as consistent as we would like. So it's just something to consider, where if someone picks up this gun who's brand new to airsoft and they've got some decent BBs in it and it shoots straight and narrow, they're gonna really love it and they're gonna be very impressed. And that is the good first impression that you are making, and that is setting your gun apart in the marketplace as something that a beginner is going to be more likely to want, because they're not going to need to do anything to it to bring it to the field and be competitive. They're not going to be frustrated that they're missing targets at range because the gun's hop-up isn't consistent enough to make those shots. That said, you don't necessarily need to include the most expensive components. There's nothing wrong with a solid one-piece plastic hop-up unit if you make it of good quality. Again, quality control is somewhat more important than quality of component. The hop-up bucking, on the other hand, you should really source the best hop-up bucking you can. Generally speaking, those are pretty cheap, even for good ones, until you get into really specialty stuff. So a good hop-up bucking that you are going to be happy with consistently is something to put the money into. But the inner barrel is something that a lot of people don't think you can cheap out on as much as you really kind of can. Because if you have a good hop-up bucking in a decent hop-up unit, or one with good quality seal at least, then if you put in an inner barrel that's like, say, aluminum, and you just have a really consistent bore quality finish, then you are still going to have some pretty respectable accuracy, even if you don't drop a lot of money on, say, a really nicely lapped 6.04 millimeter brass tight bore. If you instead have a more standard, like 6.08 millimeter aluminum inner barrel, but it's got a pretty good inner bore quality, and you took your time running it through the finishing machine, and it came out with some good smooth surfaces all the way through, it's still going to have respectable accuracy with good ammo. Is it going to be as nice as an aftermarket Prometheus type bore? No, but that gives the player something to do later on. Bear in mind, I'm not saying that all of this is going to make a beginner gun as good as something like a custom built up VFC or custom built up Crytac, but it's going to make it a solid base for a beginner to start with. Which then brings me to my next point. A beginner airsoft gun should be customization friendly. I know this from personal experience. A lot of people who buy a budget airsoft gun might be buying it with the mind of making it a project later on. Especially true of beginners who don't know that they're buying a project, but it's gonna become a project. That's how it is with airsoft. It's a nerd hobby. If you actually end up staying in it for any length of time, you're gonna end up doing stuff to your airsoft gun. So a good example of this is, again, if you make an AR, make it compatible with aftermarket rail systems, probably to TM spec, just because that's something that's really easy for everyone to get in any market. Make it compatible with aftermarket stocks, give it a mil spec buffer tube. That's just a matter of choosing your specs for your buffer tube. Make it compatible with magazines. This is something really important. Do a lot of mag compatibility testing with any gun you're making, because people might want to buy more magazines that are from other brands down the line, and if they're not compatible with aftermarket magazines, they're going to be less likely to buy your gun, or they're going to get mad, ditch the gun, and never recommend it to any of their friends, so you're still losing sales. So do plenty of magazine compatibility testing with your gun. And even if you don't have a mind for like, okay, well, maybe I want to make it so that people don't want to swap the rail system. Well, then make a rail system that's usable for people to add their favorite accessories. Key mod is one way to do this, but that's starting to kind of go the way of the dodo in favor of M-Lock, it seems like, especially because key mod has so many weird specs. Please just do real spec key mods. Stop with the non-bevel key mod. If you're still going to do key mod, just go M-Lock if you're not going to bevel it. But if you have a quad rail, that's already a step in the right direction. Making it compatible with other external components is just a good move, in my opinion. Or if your gun is kind of a fish gun, kind of a futuristic thing, and maybe isn't compatible with like rail systems and the like, give it plenty of rail space, give it plenty of attachment points, and make it so that the gun can still be personalized down the line, and this is still compatible with all the standard V2 inner components because someone can make this a project. Compatibility with upgrade components is unfortunately one of those things that is still important as long as you are making a cheaper gun, because people are going to want to upgrade the cheaper guns 9 times out of 10 eventually. Now, if you're making something really high end, and then you can get away with being a little more proprietary if you are providing the adequate part support. But proprietary is a bad word in the airsoft market. Keep it compatible for the most part, which is pretty simple, because unless you're a totally brand new airsoft factory, if you're a company, you can pretty much source whatever you want from whatever factory you're contracting to be your OEM. All right, all of this was quite a word salad. I just dumped a lot of information and opinions out there, but bear in mind, if you made it to the end of this video, all of this is just my opinion from what I've observed from market trends. You might notice that I didn't say to do anything really crazy, and that's just because I think the old adage applies of keep it simple, stupid. When you are making something that is meant to be a cheap airsoft gun for beginning and newer players, I just don't think you need to go overboard. I think you need to make sure that you have a solid foundation from which a player will have a good experience and be more likely to stay in the game. And you need to focus most of all on quality control and making sure that every single gun that comes out of your factory is of a level of quality that will ensure that the player buying it has the best experience. It's one thing to say that, hey, if there's a problem, we'll RMA it, or hey, we have a warranty. But if the gun isn't worth the shit out of the box because it blew up on this brand new player, then maybe a parent bought it for their son and their son blew up the gun, and yeah, they can RMA it, but by the time it gets back from the RMA, it's going to have been 4 to 8 weeks. And all of a sudden, the son is like, well, this is stupid. If this is just going to break, I don't want to play anymore. And guess who loses out on having more people to shoot at? Us, the hardcore airsofters. So I personally would like it very much if you could just try to deliver a consistent level of quality at this price point to keep more people interested so that all of us have more targets to shoot at and be shot at by. That way we'll all have the most fun. Now, in good news, I do think there have been a lot of really great beginner guns coming out, and I don't know if this video was necessary to make, but it was a subject I felt like sitting down and nerding out about, so maybe you found it entertaining. If not, well, that's okay. Most of my videos suck anyway. Anyway, this is E-House from Gun Gamers. I hope you found this video informative and entertaining, and maybe it gave you some things to think about if you are in the position of shopping for a new player, or if you are in the position of perhaps bringing a new player gun to market. Don't know how many of you are going to be in that latter position, but maybe, just maybe, I'll have some kind of impact. All right, for the last time, this is E-House from Gun Gamers, and I'm signing off. Peace.
Thank you for watching this video from Gun Gamers. We hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed making it. If you want to see more content from us, hit that subscribe button, and if you want to help support the channel, be sure to click the link below to buy a patch. Praise Judy.